This is the second lecture for chapters 7 through 9. We're talking about populations and relationships that species have. First one on here, ecological succession. So this is a new topic. Succession, it can be subdivided into two different parts. We can look at primary succession, which is the development of an ecosystem from scratch. So imagine the glaciers running through and scraping up any potential organic material that may have been there, and then when they recede, you have bare rock conditions. So primary succession takes a very long time. Initially, what you'll have are some moss and lichen that will come in that can attach to bare rock and grow. They will, begin to break down the rock material, and over a long period of time you will build up some organic material. You get some more complex plants that can grow in, and it proceeds eventually until you get to trees. Let me change my mouse over here really quick to the pointer. There we go. And the secondary succession is takes a lot less time. So we already have the soil conditions present. So imagine a forest that has been cut down for farming. Once farming ceases at some point in time, the forest will reestablish itself, maybe not exactly as it was prior, but it will come back to a forest ecosystem, and this is much, much faster than it would be if it was primary. So this is, again, just kind of gives that comparison of having the exposed rock to begin with, some very, very primitive plant type species coming in, and then ultimately finding our mature climax community. And secondary, where we had, again, the forest has been cleared, but then rather quickly, comparatively, we'll find ourselves back in a mature forest towards the end. So as I mentioned earlier, as far as succession goes, it doesn't necessarily have to go to the exact same conditions it was previously. It just depends partly how a forest was disturbed and what plant species are present at the time of the new succession, where it may end up with its climax community. So this just touches on the idea of biodiversity being a really good thing. The greater biodiversity you have in a particular location, the more stable and sustainable it will be. So we did an activity in class talking about the cats parachuting into a location. When the mosquitoes were removed, the flies kind of filled that hole. They had a little more room, I guess you would say. And everything worked out as far as a balance in the ecosystem. Not so much for the humans that were there, but as far as the entire ecosystem's balance, it was okay. And again, this was a very biologically diverse community for Borneo. One potential problem, is a problem actually, in ecosystems is human activities. Humans generally try to move towards less diversity. It's easier to control, and we usually just have a few species that we select for succeeding in that particular ecosystem. And that's usually a very bad idea, because if something comes along which is disruptive to that potential crop example, there's a lot of potential problems that can happen with that. So you don't have a replacement to come in and fill that particular location. So that's something that is a potential problem that we have today. Example, corn. All right, population size. Things that will affect a population. Births and deaths. The more births you have, the higher population goes up, and conversely with deaths. Immigration and immigration. Immigration is people coming in. Immigration is people leaving. And we can judge population change based on this equation. Again, these are our inputs into a system, and these are our outputs, or no longer in the population. and just the idea of population ecology. There you go. So, what goes into determining how fast a population grows? Primarily, what we're looking at as far as the potential of a population is we're looking at these top two, of course, but typically when population ecologists look at a population, they're really focusing on the pre-productive age. So these are the ones that are going to have the largest impact in the future. We're not so much looking at who's at reproductive age at that time, because they're kind of already undergoing that. So if they were to have offspring, they're doing it right now. We're looking at the potential for the future, so a young population, typically under 18, maybe 15. So limits, biotic and environmental resistance, intrinsic rate of growth, just the definition. So when you see R or R selected species, we are typically talking about intrinsic rate of increase. And usually you're talking about smaller type species. If you want to talk mammals, mice, rabbits, but you're also talking about plants in general, but bacteria is another really good one. And if they had unlimited resources. So as long as there is resources available to them, their populations will continue to grow. The second one, carrying capacity, K selected species. These are usually larger species, and they're very much controlled. Their populations are controlled by some type of density factor, so some limiting factors that's surrounding them that determines what their total numbers can be. So we went through this nice list in class. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because it's quite long. But just a comparison, you could pause this once we get them all on here and go over it in a little more detail. But we'll spend some time talking about a couple of these a little bit later. So let me just go back here one more time. One thing just to take a look at is this last couple on here, the population regulation. So what typically determines how many of a species you could have. So for our selected species, they're typically density independent. So, which means it doesn't necessarily matter how many are there. They're not going to be stopped by the amount of each other that they have there. It's usually some exterior factor, whether it be temperature, weather, or some environmental factor that comes in and can wipe them out. It's not necessarily crowding of each other that is determining how many you can have. Just the opposite, as K-selected species, they're much more stable as far as their development goes, and we can almost predict, based on environmental factors around them, stable environmental factors around them, what the population should be. So population ecologists can usually make pretty good predictions with K-selected species. The last one, as far as population dynamics, R-selected species are very variable as far as their numbers go. They will spike and they will die off. Just think about the potato salad on Sunday afternoon for some graduation party. The bacteria starting off could be very, very low. Give it about 2 to 4 hours out there, and their populations will spike to a very high number. Silly example. But for K-selected species, usually the population is very stable year in and year out. Okay. This curve here you'd want to be familiar with. Typically, again, we're looking at this. We're looking at the top at being K-selected species, where most of our individuals survive, close to 100%. And over a period of time, coming towards late in age, they will start to drop off predictably. For our selected species here at the bottom, they will put out a very large number of offspring, and most of them don't make it. Those that do make it at some point typically are going to survive and eventually get to old age. And then for some species, somewhere in the middle, it's usually not a straight line, but birds are a nice example. There's no rhyme or reason necessarily as far as surviving or not. Typically, it's a constant or continuous loss anywhere in their lifespan. So it's not something you can predict early or late. Okay, making a comparison between exponential and logistic growth models. I'm actually going to stop here because we're about 10 minutes into this lecture, and we'll pick this one up here for this next part.